The fourth dead planet in 2 years, and I was already writing the preliminary report before we touched down. Nitrogen ice, trace methane frost, a magnetic field barely worth measuring. Geological activity flatlined somewhere around 2 billion years back. The Harmon-Lusk Extraction Consortium paid me to confirm what its orbital probes already knew, and I'd gotten efficient at it. Scan the surface, core a few samples, log the mineral spread, flag anything a mining rig might care about, file the survey, collect the completion bonus. 4 weeks of transit for 3 days of fieldwork on a world that had been dead longer than complex life had existed on Earth. I finished the entry for subsurface calcium silicates and switched to the thermal array. Neil Harkin held the lander in a slow descent pattern, 200 meters above the surface, while the array painted the terrain below us in temperature gradients. Everything registered the same. -216, -214, -218. A world so cold that nitrogen pooled in solid sheets across the basins, catching our floodlights like dark glass. Mineral survey is going to run about 6 hours once we're on the ground, I said. I'll need the rover for at least 4 of those. Doug Peppers leaned forward from the command seat behind me, reviewing his display. Corporate documentation, mission liability forms, the stack of pre-drafted reports Harmon-Lusk expected him to submit at each phase milestone. Doug ran missions the way a claims adjuster runs a case file. Everything logged, everything time-stamped, everything defensible if something went wrong and the company needed someone to blame. He was good at it. I'd worked 2 prior surveys with him, and whatever else I thought about his instinct to document before he acted, nobody had ever pulled a procedural violation from one of his missions. You'll have 3 hours on the rover, Doug said. We're on a fuel budget. Martin Lacey, our biologist, sat across the cabin with his sample kit already assembled on his lap. Harmon-Lusk protocol required a life sciences specialist on any extrasolar survey, even when the target world couldn't support a bacterium. Martin had done 5 of these rides. The most exciting biological finding he'd ever logged was a subsurface amino acid trace on a dwarf planet in the Kepler corridor, and the lab back on Ganymede had later reclassified it as instrument contamination. He spent most of his field hours running backup readings for me and pretending it didn't bother him. Lately he had stopped pretending. 3 weeks in transit had sharpened the bones in his face. He carried a permanent orbital insertion headache behind his eyes and kept flexing his fingers against the joint stiffness from repeated gravity transitions. He was 38 and looked older under ship light, a man trained to study life who had built a career out of confirming its absence. "Anything on the thermal?" Neil asked from the pilot's chair. I was about to give the standard answer, cold as expected, when the array flagged a return I hadn't seen on any prior survey. A concentrated thermal point, 4 degrees above ambient, localized to an area roughly 300 meters across, sitting in the middle of a nitrogen ice plain, like a warm coin on a frozen table. "Hold descent," I said. "I've got a thermal anomaly at the surface, bearing 073, range about 600 meters from our current track." Doug was already at my shoulder. "Classification?" "Looks like a subsurface geothermal pocket. Possible vent activity." I pulled the spectral data. The thermal profile was stable, clean of venting signatures or outgassing compounds. Just a warm spot on a frozen world. If this is an active vent, it's the first one documented on a rogue body this size. That's a bonus modifier and a named discovery. Doug's expression shifted the way it always did when money was on the table. "Redirect to the anomaly. We'll set down at safe distance and approach on foot." Neil brought us down 300 meters east of the thermal source, on solid nitrogen ice that took the lander's weight without fracture. The 4 of us suited up in standard EVA configuration. Full seal, 18-hour air supply, tethered comms. Doug ran the checklist. Martin rechecked his sample kit. I packed the core drill and the portable spectrometer and stepped out onto the surface of a planet that had never known sunlight. The ice field stretched in every direction under black sky. The planet had drifted far enough from any stellar neighborhood that the nearest points of light were too dim for the naked eye, though my visor could amplify them into a pale scatter if I toggled the enhancement filter. I left it off. The floodlights from the lander gave us about 150 meters of hard visibility. Beyond that, the dark was total. We moved toward the Anomaly in standard survey formation. Doug and me at the front on foot, Martin and Neil trailing in the rover with the equipment sled hitched behind them. The ice under our boots was smooth and dark, and each step made a compressed creak through the suit's external pickups. 300 meters. 5 minutes of walking. The temperature on my wrist display crept upward. -212. -209. -204. Doug stopped. I nearly walked into him. In the wash of our combined suit lights, about 40 meters ahead, the nitrogen ice ended. A curb began. Poured concrete, standard American residential, the kind you'd find in any subdivision built between the 1950s and the 1990s. Beyond the curb, an asphalt road. Beyond the road, a sidewalk. Beyond the sidewalk, a lawn. Green grass, trimmed, edged along the walkway. A house stood behind the lawn. 2 stories, colonial style, white clapboard siding, black shutters, a front porch with a wooden railing. The windows had curtains. The porch had a welcome mat. A mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, the flag down, painted the same shade of blue as the house's front door. 7 houses. That was what we found. 7 houses arranged around a cul-de-sac, each one different. Colonial, ranch, split level, Cape Cod, craftsman, a low modernist box, a 1-story brick rambler. All sitting on green lawns with poured driveways and concrete sidewalks, and a street sign at the entrance that read Harlow Court. Under a black sky, on a planet where nitrogen froze solid and the nearest star was light years away. "Nobody moves," Doug said. I counted to 60 in my head, standing on the nitrogen ice at the edge of a suburban cul-de-sac on a rogue planet. And then I walked forward because the anomaly was geological and geology was mine. The spectrometer hung from my shoulder. The core drill was in my right hand. Doug called my name once and then let me go. The grass was Kentucky bluegrass. I knew because I'd grown up mowing it in Overland Park, Kansas, every Saturday from April through October, until I turned 16, and my father decided the riding mower was a better investment than my labor. I knelt on the lawn of the Colonial, house number 4 according to the mailbox, and drove the core into the soil. 8 centimeters of topsoil. Rich, loamy, biochemically active, registering as a standard Midwestern residential soil profile on the spectrometer. Below that, with a boundary sharp enough to cut paper, the planet's native nitrogen ice. The soil stopped, and the ice began as if someone had drawn a line with a ruler. The grass roots terminated at exactly 8 centimeters, each one severed clean at the interface. Below, 2 billion years of dead planetary crust. The lawn was real. The soil was active. Both ended at a clean plane and sat on top of a planet that should have killed them. "Ray," Doug said over the comm, "what are you seeing?" "Topsoil over nitrogen ice. Abrupt boundary. It's like somebody laid sod on a frozen parking lot. Except the biology is active, and the root systems just stop at 8 centimeters. That's impossible on this surface." "I'm aware." I stood and looked at the houses again. Every surface was intact. Paint, wood, glass, concrete. But everything carried a uniformity that bothered me in a way I couldn't immediately name. Every house looked pristine. The driveways were uncracked, the roofs unpatched, the paint unfaded, the gutters stainless, the foundations untouched by frost heave. Each one looked new and settled at the same time, as if it had been here for decades and nothing had ever touched it. The windows were bright. A warm glow pushed through the curtains of every house on the cul-de-sac, sourceless and directionless, the colour of late afternoon in a kitchen with the overhead light on and the sun coming through a west-facing window. My visor's light detection system registered darkness. My eyes insisted someone was home. Doug tried to raise the old gate. our mothership holding orbit 1,200 kilometers above us. The comm channel connected, but the response came back garbled and half a second late, too much delay for the distance. Something between us and the ship was bending the signal, adding density where vacuum should have been clean. "We go inside," Doug said. "Standard entry protocol. Caldwell and I take point. Harkin and Lacey, hold at the door." The front door of number 4 Harlow Court was unlocked. The handle turned with the easy resistance of a well-maintained lock, and the door swung inward on hinges that worked exactly as a door should work. Smooth, weighted, silent. The interior matched the exterior's precision. A living room opened to the right. Sofa, armchair, coffee table, a television set from the early 2000s, a bookshelf with spines I couldn't make out through my visor at that distance. A staircase rose to the second floor. The kitchen was visible through an open archway at the back, and I could see countertops, cabinet handles, a refrigerator with a calendar pinned to it by a magnet shaped like an apple. Family photographs covered the hallway wall. Framed, arranged, the kind of gallery a family builds over years. Holidays, birthdays, a backyard barbecue in summer light, a posed portrait in front of a fireplace. Every photograph showed human figures in correct proportion, wearing appropriate clothing, positioned in natural domestic arrangements. The faces were gone. Each one was smeared, smoothed, as if a thumb had been dragged across wet paint while the rest of the image dried sharp and clear. Bodies, hands, posture, clothing, all intact. Faces, erased down to skin-colored blank. "Doug, look at the photographs." He was already studying them. "Document everything. Touch nothing." I moved through the house with the spectrometer running. The walls were standard drywall over pine studs. The wiring was copper. The floors were red oak. Every material came back compositionally accurate to American residential construction. But the molecular arrangement was off in a way that took me a moment to identify. Too regular. The wood showed one flawless, unvarying grain. The drywall compound held a perfect internal matrix. The chemistry was correct and the structure was perfect, and real building materials are never perfect. These walls and floors had been assembled from textbook definitions of their substances. Every atom placed according to formula, every grain of wood computed from the molecular weight of cellulose up, as if the blueprint had never touched a sawmill or a quarry. The calendar on the refrigerator showed a monthly grid. The year column showed 2019. The month column, where a word like October or March should have been printed, contained a string of digits. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55. I stared at it until the pattern registered. The Fibonacci sequence printed where a month's name should be. Whatever had built this house understood that a label belonged in that position and had reached for the nearest pattern it could find. Our telemetry had been unreliable since the threshold. Packet loss, intermittent nulls, status delays that resolved on refresh. All 4 suit feeds flickered in and out as though the house were arguing with the instruments about what a body was. I logged it as interference until Martin's patience ran out. He had been waiting at the front door with Neil, but by the time Doug and I came back downstairs, Martin was in the upstairs hallway, his sample kit open, his gloved fingers running along the wall. "The biosignatures in here are extraordinary," he said. His visor was fogging from heavy breathing. Pure professional fascination, the expression of a man who'd spent 5 missions finding nothing and had just walked into everything. "The air composition is breathable, oxygen-nitrogen mix, roughly sea level pressure 21 Celsius. He looked at his own helmet seals. "I want to test it." "Absolutely not," Doug said. Martin unsealed his helmet, pulled it off, and took a long breath before Doug finished speaking. The air in the house held him. He stood in the hallway of a house on a planet without a breathable atmosphere, and he breathed, and his face flushed with color, and his eyes focused with the clarity of a man who'd just stepped out of a pressurized cabin into clean mountain air. He rolled his shoulders. "The headache is gone," he said. "The one from orbital insertion. I feel better than I have in weeks. His feed stabilized on my wrist display. Core temperature, dropping. Heart rate, 0. Blood oxygen saturation, absent. Respiratory function, undetected. According to every sensor threaded through his suit's underlayer, Martin Lacey had been clinically dead for 13 minutes, the exact duration since we'd crossed the threshold of the house. Martin! I held up my wrist so he could see his own numbers. Your suit says you've been dead since we walked in. He looked at the display. He looked at his own hands, flexing them. He looked at me. I'm standing right here, Ray. Put your helmet back on. Doug gave the sentence the weight he reserved for orders he would enforce with his hands if he had to. Martin replaced the helmet, sealed it. His telemetry held at the same readings. 0 cardiac activity, absent respiration, blood gas exchange flatlined. The suit continued to register him as dead while Martin stood in front of us, moving and speaking and thinking clearly. Whatever was sustaining him inside this house was doing it through a process his suit couldn't detect, because the suit was designed to monitor biology, and what was keeping Martin Lacey upright belonged to a different category. We checked the other houses. Each one was furnished, complete, and empty. Each had the same molecular perfection, the same faceless photographs, the same warm glow from nowhere. The ranch at number 7 had a backyard I will carry with me until something worse replaces it. A swimming pool. Rectangular, residential standard, concrete deck, aluminum ladder, a diving board at the deep end with the non-slip coating worn to grey. The pool was full, and the surface was perfectly still, perfectly transparent, and through it I could see stars. Distant, impossibly deep, scattered across a blackness that continued down past any measurement my instruments could return. Galaxies hung at the far edge of perception, smeared by distance into pale marks. The pool held open cosmos, genuine astronomical depth, set into the concrete behind a suburban ranch house on a dead planet. I picked up a pebble from the pool deck. Smooth, grey, the kind of decorative stone a homeowner buys in bags from a garden centre. I dropped it over the edge. It broke the surface without a ripple, fell straight, and as it fell, it shrank, proportionally, as if distance were compressing it in real time. It passed through where the pool floor should have been and kept going, smaller and smaller. A grey dot, becoming a dark point, becoming indistinguishable from the stars around it until it was gone. The spectrometer tracked it for 4 seconds before losing the return signal. In 4 seconds it had travelled farther than our ship could cross in a year. We're leaving, Doug said. Right now, all of us. Back to the lander. Nobody argued. Neil drove the rover. The road extended from the mouth of Harlow Court in a straight line, asphalt over what should have been nitrogen ice, heading north toward the coordinates where the lander sat. 1/2 kilometre, a 2-minute drive at survey speed. We drove for 41 minutes. The rover's navigation system tracked our heading, speed and distance without interruption. According to the log, we travelled 41 kilometres on a bearing that should have carried us far past the lander and off the thermal anomaly entirely, deep onto the open ice plain. The terrain outside the rover's windows showed the road extending ahead, straight and clean, with dark ice on either side and the black sky above. Then the headlights found asphalt curving to the right, a concrete sidewalk, a green lawn, a mailbox, Harlow Court. Neil's hands tightened on the steering yoke. We drove in a straight line. The nav confirms it. Turn around, Doug said. Different heading. South-southwest. 38 kilometres. Harlow Court, due east, 27 kilometres. Harlow Court, northwest, 19 kilometres. Harlow Court. Doug ordered Neil off the road entirely. The rover was built for rough survey terrain. It could handle the ice. Neil drove across the open nitrogen ice field in a deadline for 40 minutes, while the navigation computer logged a steady bearing and consistent speed. The cul-de-sac fell behind us. The headlights cut clean tracks through featureless frozen ground. The ice ended. Asphalt began. The street sign said Harlow Court. Each time we arrived, the neighborhood had changed. First return. A bicycle lay on its side in the front yard of house number 2, pedals askew, as if a child had dropped it and run inside. Second, a garden hose stretched across the driveway of number 5, connected to a spigot at one end and lying in the grass at the other. And water, actual water, was seeping from the nozzle, darkening a circle of soil around it. Third return, the curtains in house number 6, which had been open on our first visit, were drawn. Fourth return, after the off-road attempt, a sprinkler stood in the yard of number 3, spinning in slow arcs, throwing droplets that caught the sourceless light. The cul-de-sac was filling itself in. Each time we tried to leave and came back, it added something domestic, something inhabited, as if our circuits around the perimeter were feeding it the energy or the permission to become more complete. "We've burned through a third of the rover's fuel cells," Neil said. He was gripping the steering yoke hard enough that the material of his gloves compressed white across his knuckles. "If we keep driving, we'll have enough charge to idle for heat and air recycling for about 9 hours. After that, we're on suit reserves." Doug ordered the rover parked and the crew inside the houses for a thorough search. New objective. Anything that explained the spatial folding. Anything that gave us a direction the cul-de-sac would actually release. I took house number 3, the Cape Cod, while Doug took number 1, and Martin and Neil worked number 5 together, because Doug didn't want Neil alone and didn't want Martin unwatched. The ground floor of number 3 matched the others. Furnished, precise, warm, faceless photographs on the walls. I went upstairs, a hallway with 3 doors, master bedroom, bathroom, and at the end of the hallway, a smaller door, slightly ajar, with a painted wooden letter hanging from a nail at eye height. The letter J, a child's room. Small bed with a spacecraft-patterned comforter. A dresser with a lamp shaped like a cartoon rocket. Shelves along one wall packed with toys, action figures, building blocks, a plastic model airplane, a snow globe containing a tiny mountain scene with trees made of green fuzz, and a cabin the size of my thumbnail. Sitting between the model airplane and the snow globe, on the middle shelf, at the exact height a boy would reach without stretching, its far side struts sunk seamlessly into the drywall behind it. Our lander. 15 centimeters tall, every detail correct. The Harmon Lusk corporate decal on the hull, sun-bleached at the edges the way the real one was from our previous planetary approach. The landing struts still extended, resting on the wooden shelf the way they'd rested on the nitrogen ice. The scoring along the heat shield from atmospheric entry on a world 3 missions ago that maintenance had never bothered to resurface. My suit's thermal sensor spiked the moment I brought my hand close. Engine heat, real fuel cell output, radiating from a vehicle smaller than my forearm. I checked my wrist display. The lander's transponder, the identification signal that every Harmon Lusk vehicle broadcast continuously for salvage recovery, was active. Its signal originated from the object on the shelf in front of me. Range 0 meters. This was our lander. The vehicle that had carried us to the surface, that Neil had set down on the ice 300 meters from the cul-de-sac, had been moved, compressed, and placed on a child's toy shelf with its mass unchanged, its fuel reserves matching what Neil had reported at landing, its transponder broadcasting from inside a bedroom that belonged to a child who had never existed. I pressed the comm. "Doug, I found the lander." "Say again?" "I'm in the upstairs bedroom of house 3. The lander is on a shelf, miniaturized, 15 centimeters tall, between a model airplane and a snow globe. Transponder confirmed, thermal output confirmed. It's the real vehicle, shrunk to the size of a coffee mug." Silence on the channel. 4 or 5 seconds of it. In that pause, the room around me seemed to wait with the careful stillness of a child who has shown an adult a secret and cannot yet tell whether it will be praised or punished. Then Doug's voice came back, stripped down to the procedural reflex that 20 years of corporate expedition work had hammered into the base of his brain. "All crew, consolidate at House 4. Conserve suit resources. We are not leaving this cul-de-sac by vehicle. New primary objective. Determine the nature and mechanism of this environment. Secondary objective. Restore or recover our means of extraction. We gathered in the living room of number 4, the Colonial, the first house we'd entered. Doug set a watch rotation. Neil checked suit reserves and started calculating how long we could sustain 4 men on existing air, power, and hydration cartridges. Martin sat on the sofa and stared at the faceless photographs on the wall with an expression I couldn't read through his visor. His suit still broadcasting the biometrics of a corpse who was breathing fine. Outside, the sprinkler in the yard of number 3 kept turning. Water arced across the lawn and landed on grass that grew from 8 centimeters of soil over solid nitrogen ice, on a planet where water should have frozen before it left the nozzle. The droplets caught the sourceless light and fell like rain in a place that had never known weather. I woke on the living room floor of number 4 Harlow Court with my suit's chrono showing I'd been down for just under 3 hours. Doug had taken first watch. He sat in the armchair by the front window, visor raised, staring at the cul-de-sac through the glass. The house had changed while I slept. The furniture had rearranged. The coffee table had moved closer to the sofa, the armchair Doug occupied had shifted 6 inches toward the window, and a second armchair had appeared where none had been before, positioned at the angle you'd set for conversation. On the end table beside me sat a coffee mug. White ceramic, blue logo. The words Harmon Lusk Field Operations printed around a stylized pickaxe. My mug. The one I kept on my desk at the Ganymede field office. The one I drank from every morning during the 3 months between survey deployments. I'd owned it for 4 years. I'd never mentioned it to anyone on this crew. For most of the last decade, that mug had been the closest thing I had to a household object. Packed into storage when I shipped out, unpacked onto the same rented desk when I came back, waiting for me in the only room I returned to often enough to leave something behind. The house knew what I reached for when I woke up. I left the mug where it sat and walked to the hallway where the family photographs hung. Something in the corner of my vision had pulled me there before I was fully awake, and I stood in front of the largest frame, the holiday dinner, the one that had shown a blurred family gathered around a table, and the photograph had changed. The face at the head of the table was mine. Sharp, clear, unmistakable. My face in a room I'd never entered, wearing clothes I didn't own, sitting at a table I'd never seen, surrounded by people whose faces were still smeared. A woman to my left, 2 boys across from me, an older man at the far end. Their posture, their proximity, the way they leaned toward the center of the table, suggested a family that had been together long enough to stop performing togetherness. I had never met any of them. I was certain of that the way you're certain of your own name. And standing in the hallway, looking at the photograph, I mourned them. A specific, weighted grief, the kind that sits behind the sternum and makes breathing a voluntary act. I missed the woman I'd never met, worried about the older of the 2 boys, the one whose posture suggested he was pulling away from the table, and the worry was precise enough to feel like memory. I stepped back from the photograph. The grief loosened its grip by degrees, like walking out of a warm room into cold air. By the time I reached the living room, it was manageable. Present, residual, a handprint on cooling glass. The suburb was searching for stable human emotional architecture to anchor itself, and it was finding purchase in the unguarded parts of my mind. Martin called us to house number 7 over the comm. He'd been in there alone for over 2 hours. Doug had allowed it because Martin was the only crew member actively gathering data, and Doug's new primary objective required data. Martin had set up the portable receiver on the kitchen table of the ranch house, connected to his suit's audio processing software. The static we'd been hearing on every frequency since entering the cul-de-sac played through the receiver's speaker while a spectrogram scrolled across his tablet. "I've been recording and compressing this for the last 90 minutes, Martin said. "Watch the display. He played the processed version. Slowed by a factor of roughly 400 and rendered as a visual waveform, the static resolved into repeating sequences. 4 distinct signal types cycling in long chains, each type appearing in precise ratios to the others. Adenine, Martin said, pointing to the first. Thymine, guanine, cytosine. The 4 nucleotide bases of human DNA. I ran the sequence against the human genome reference in my sample kit. What we're hearing on every radio frequency in this neighborhood is a carrier signal encoded with human genetic information. The 6% I've decoded so far matches chromosome 17 with better than 99% accuracy. The neighborhood was structured around human biology at every level. The architecture mimicked American suburban planning. The electromagnetic environment carried our species' genetic code pressed into its background noise, the way a watermark is pressed into paper. The static was us. While Martin presented his findings, Doug was in the next room, cycling through frequencies on his headset, trying to re-establish clean contact with the old gate. I heard him stop cycling. I heard him speak his standard hail. Old gate, this is Peppers. Confirm receipt. And then I heard his own voice come back through the speaker, repeating the commands he'd given hours earlier during the landing approach, played back as current orders from the orbiting ship. Doug tried to break through, talking over the playback, asking direct questions the recording couldn't anticipate. The loop adjusted. His recorded voice incorporated fragments of what he'd just said, weaving them into a new version of his old commands, as if the signal was Doug's own voice continuing a conversation with itself. He disconnected. When he came into the kitchen, his face was grey beneath the visor. The old gate comm is compromised. Everything I transmit comes back in my own voice. I can't confirm whether the ship is receiving. Martin started explaining his plans for further signal analysis, and I stopped listening because through the kitchen window of house number 7, I could see a figure standing in the doorway of house number 6. Human-shaped, male build, average height. He stood on the front porch with one hand on the doorframe, the way a man stands when he comes outside to check whether it's raining. His surface was wrong, solid from a distance, but as I moved closer to the window, the details refused to sharpen. His outline held, his proportions were correct, but his substance seemed assembled from compressed ambient sound given visible density, the drone of a refrigerator motor, the creak of a wood frame settling under its own weight, the low hiss of dead channel signal. All of it packed together, shaped, wearing a human silhouette the way fabric wears a shape when it's draped over a frame. Doug. Doug was at the window beside me. Neil came up behind us. The figure turned its head toward our window. It had a face, or the suggestion of one, features rendered in the same compressed sound texture, no more detailed than a charcoal sketch drawn from poor memory. It opened its mouth, and what came out was a collage, fragments of Doug's landing commands, 2 technical terms from my geological dictation, a phrase from Martin's bioanalysis, all rearranged into a sentence that carried the cadence of a neighborly greeting, and no meaning I could pass. It's using our voices, Neil said. Those are words we said. Reassembled, I said. It's building speech from samples the way it builds everything else. More figures appeared over the next hour, in windows, on porches. One walked a segment of sidewalk from the mailbox of number 2 to the driveway of number 3 and stopped, as if it had reached the boundary of a behavior it knew how to perform. Each figure was built from different source material, one primarily from the heating system of House 3, another from the rover's idling engine vibration, a third from a deep tonal drone that seemed to rise from the ground itself. They wore human shapes. They attempted human behavior. They were the cul-de-sac trying to populate itself. The figure nearest the rover, the one built from engine vibration, walked toward the vehicle, reached for the driver's door handle, and turned to look at Neil. Its face had changed. The compressed sound features had sharpened, pulled detail from a source I couldn't identify, and what looked back at Neil from across the cul-de-sac was Neil's own face, his proportions, the line of his jaw, the way his hair sat under a helmet he wasn't wearing. Neil drew his sidearm, the compact survey pistol Harmon Lusk issued for wildlife hazard on biologically active worlds, and fired twice. The figure came apart in a burst of raw signal. Engine hum, radio hiss, and something that sounded exactly like Neil laughing during a conversation from earlier that day. The sound fragments scattered across the pavement and the lawns and were absorbed into the surfaces of the houses. 10 meters to the right, the figure reconstituted. Same shape, same posture. Neil's face, now wearing an expression that looked confused and injured. A man who had been struck by someone he'd trusted and was still trying to understand why. Neil raised the pistol again. Doug caught his wrist. "They can't be destroyed," I said. "They're organized sound. There's nothing physical to shoot." "Then what am I supposed to do with this?" Neil's voice had climbed into a register I'd never heard from him. Thin, pressurized, vibrating at the edges of control. "Stay with the crew and follow my orders," Doug said. He hadn't released Neil's wrist. "Holster the weapon." Neil holstered it. For the next 10 minutes, he refused to look through any window where glass could give him back a reflection. The figure across the cul-de-sac watched him do it, wearing his face, and then resumed walking toward the rover as if the shooting had been a minor interruption in an ordinary afternoon. The suburb held 9 visible residents now, moving or standing at various points around the cul-de-sac, all assembled from ambient sound, all wearing human shapes that borrowed more and more from the 4 of us. And above them, the sky had changed. The starless black that had covered Harlow Court since our arrival was showing structure. Thin curved lines, geometric and vast, tessellated in patterns that suggested the interior surface of something, as if the darkness above the neighborhood was a ceiling, and the ceiling had a texture, and the texture belonged to the inside of a structure large enough to hold a sky. Martin had been running the survey drone in automated mapping patterns from the kitchen of house number 7, which he'd begun calling my place, with a comfort that made the dead reading on his telemetry feel worse every time he said it. The drone flew a grid 40 meters above the cul-de-sac and returned composite overhead imagery to his tablet. He set the tablet on the table and let me study it. The recognition took about 10 seconds. The 7 houses sat at positions matching synaptic bodies, the dense nodes where neural connections converge in biological nervous tissue. The streets and sidewalks between them traced the branching architecture of dendrites. The cul-de-sac's curve formed the soma of a central neuron. The road extending outward and looping back was a signal pathway that terminated in itself because there was nothing else to connect to. "It's a neural cluster," I said. "It's a thought," Martin said. "One thought. The last one it has enough architecture to hold." "What is it, Martin?" He leaned back in his chair. He looked rested, healthier than he'd been since we'd boarded the old gate 3 weeks ago, which was wrong in every measurable direction because the suit wrapped around his apparently dead body should have been a coffin. Something vast enough that a planet is a minor piece of its cognitive range. Something old enough that it's been collecting our signals for centuries. Radio transmissions, genetic data, mathematics, everything we've broadcast into open space. It's been dying for a long time, Ray, drifting between stars with its mind coming apart. The suburb is its version of holding on to something warm while it goes. You can't know that from a drone image and some radio analysis. Martin rested one hand on the kitchen table. His fingertips moved slowly across the laminate, as if reading grain that wasn't there. I can feel it. Through the walls, through the floors, through the sound the houses make when they settle. There's a presence behind all of this, and it's enormous, and it's afraid, and it is the saddest thing I have ever been near. That was the conversation where I understood I was losing Martin. His voice carried an unwavering certainty that had displaced every gram of professional caution, the conviction of a man who had stopped questioning his own perception, because his perception had become, for the first time in his career, full of something worth perceiving. I found him 2 hours later in the living room of number 7, eating. A plate of food sat on the coffee table: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, a glass of water. Warm. Arranged as if someone who cared about him had prepared it and left it where he'd find it. Martin had removed his entire suit. He sat on the sofa in his base layer, eating with utensils that shouldn't have existed on a planet 4 billion kilometers from the nearest kitchen. Martin, that food is generated by the same system that built everything else in this neighborhood. It tastes like chicken. It has caloric content. I tested it. He held up the handheld analyzer. The screen showed a standard nutritional breakdown. Whatever this place is doing, it's doing it at the molecular level. The food is as real as the grass, and the grass is as real as the soil. The question of where real stops applying is more interesting than you're allowing it to be. Your suit has been registering you as dead for over 14 hours. My suit is calibrated for a physics that doesn't apply here. He took another bite. He chewed and swallowed, and his body processed the food the way bodies process food, and his suit sat in a heap by the door. The argument I was making, that the entity's hospitality was a function of its need and would end when its cognition ended, landed against a wall Martin had already built and furnished and moved into. While I was failing to reach Martin, Doug was solving the problem his way, through procedure, force, and the conviction that any obstacle could be dismantled with the right tool. He decided that if the lander had been miniaturized and placed inside house number 3, then it was physically present in the structure and could be physically extracted. He took a pry bar from the rover's toolkit and went to work on the bedroom wall. I heard the first strike from across the cul-de-sac. Drywall cracked, wood groaned. A vibration rose through the ground that didn't belong to any material in the house. It passed through my boots and through the suit frame into my teeth. Then the sky broke. A line appeared above the cul-de-sac, running from horizon to horizon, splitting the dark the way a crack splits ice. Through the gap I could see something beyond the sky. A void, absolute and textureless, solid in its emptiness, like staring at the back of a closed eye, magnified to cosmic scale. It carried the raw material of ending, pressed against the neighborhood's diminishing warmth. The suburb convulsed. Every house on Harlow Court shook simultaneously. Temperature swung 40 degrees in 9 seconds. My suit's thermal regulator triggered a warning I'd never heard in 4 years of fieldwork. The assembled residents, scattered across the cul-de-sac in their pantomime of domestic evening, froze in place. Then they jittered, rapid, discontinuous, frames missing from a recording. Then they resumed, and their movements were wrong. Arms bending at joints that shouldn't exist. Walking patterns reversed, feet striking heel first and rolling backward. One figure climbed the exterior wall of house number 2 with its hands and feet oriented as if the wall were a floor, and it moved with the steady ease of a man walking to his mailbox. I found Doug in the upstairs bedroom of number 3, pry bar in hand, a section of wall torn open beside the shelf where the miniature lander sat. Through the gap, the lander's hull was visible, still 15 centimeters tall, still radiating engine heat, now exposed through torn drywall and splintered pine studs. Behind the lander, through the breach Doug had opened, the wall did not terminate in an adjacent room or an exterior surface. It opened into a vertical stairwell that descended straight down into darkness. Stairs continuing below the range of our suit lights, without landing, railing, or bottom. "Doug, stop! You're damaging it!" "I'm extracting our vehicle." You hit the wall, and the sky cracked. The residence glitched. The temperature swung 40 degrees. That's not coincidence. I pointed through the bedroom window. The suburb is its cognitive structure. You're tearing open the thing we're inside. Doug looked. The fracture in the sky was widening by degrees, and through it the void pressed against the neighborhood's remaining warmth like a weight, bearing down on a compromised roof. The assembled residents were still moving wrong. One had stopped near the rover and was opening and closing the driver's door in a 2-second loop. The same motion repeated, a behavior pattern stuck in a cycle it couldn't exit. "If the thought collapses," I said, "we go with it." Doug stared at the crack in the sky, at the malfunctioning residence, at the stairwell descending into forever through a child's bedroom wall. His grip tightened around the pry bar. For a second I thought he would keep going, because stopping meant admitting that the mission had moved beyond every procedure he trusted. Then his shoulders dropped by half an inch. He put the pry bar down. The suburb was coming apart. In house number 1, the downstairs hallway had extended. What had been a corridor 4 meters long now stretched beyond sight, the far wall receding every time I tried to fix my eyes on it. The wallpaper repeated, the same floral pattern cycling every few meters, but each repetition degraded, flowers losing petals, colors shifting toward grey, as if the memory sustaining the pattern was wearing through from overuse. In house number 5, the kitchen drawers opened onto other rooms. The silverware drawer contained a view of the upstairs bathroom in house 6, seen from above, as if the drawer were a window cut into a different building's ceiling. The junk drawer held a length of hallway from house 2, compressed and curved like a photograph wrapped around a cylinder. The assembled residents had stopped trying. They stood throughout the cul-de-sac, motionless, their sound-built bodies distorting. Some stretched vertically, others compressed toward the ground. One dissolved in a slow cascade from the shoulders down, its component frequencies separating and drifting apart like smoke. The signal they emitted had lost its speech fragments. It was organized information losing its organization. The sound of a mind forgetting how to hold a shape. Doug had pulled Neil and me back to the living room of house number 1, where he could see both the rover and the street. He reviewed suit reserves while Neil recalculated a survival window that was shrinking by the hour. Neil had retreated into procedure, the way men retreat into procedure when everything else has failed, checking and rechecking equipment that couldn't save him because the act of checking was the last controllable thing in his world. Whenever a window caught his reflection, he turned his helmet away. Doug was still giving orders. He'd ordered Martin to return from house 7. Martin hadn't responded. I stood at the window and watched the crack in the sky widen. The sourceless light that had warmed the cul-de-sac since our arrival was dimming, contracting, pulling inward toward the center of the neighborhood, the way heat concentrates in a body losing blood, retreating from the extremities to protect the core. The edges of the lawns were going dark. The asphalt beyond the cul-de-sac's mouth had already vanished into the encroaching black. The rhythm of the collapse was legible. The entity was destabilizing because we, its only coherent pattern source, the template it had crystallized around, were rejecting it. Doug had torn open its structure. Neil had shot at its residents. I'd spent hours treating it as a problem to be measured and catalogued and escaped. Martin was the only one who'd accepted what it was offering, and one man couldn't sustain a cognitive architecture that needed the complexity of 4 minds to maintain coherence. We were killing it by trying to survive it. I made a decision that went against everything Doug had ordered and everything my own training prescribed. "I'm going into house 4 alone," I told Doug. "I need you and Neil to stay here and keep your suits sealed." "For what purpose?" "I'm going to talk to it." Doug's face carried the expression of a man deciding whether the person in front of him had become a mission liability. "Talk to what, Caldwell?" "The intelligence that built this neighborhood. The thing whose dying thought we are standing inside. We've tried fighting. We've tried driving. We've tried cutting through walls. Every act of resistance damages the structure, and the structure is the only barrier between us and that." I pointed at the crack in the sky, at the void pressing through it. "I'm going to try something else." Doug was quiet for several seconds. Outside, another assembled resident collapsed, its human form losing cohesion, slumping into a layered heap of raw sound that spread across the sidewalk, still carrying fragments of Neil's voice braided with the harmonic of a heating system. "You have 30 minutes, Doug said. I walked across the cul-de-sac, alone. The light was weak now, concentrated in a shrinking circle around the centre of the neighbourhood. The grass at the edges of the lawns had turned grey. The asphalt was cracking, losing resolution, the way a compressed image fragments when you push past its data limit. I entered house number 4, the Colonial. The first house we'd walked into, the one with my face in the photograph and the Fibonacci calendar on the refrigerator. I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table. For several seconds I said nothing. The house settled around me. Wood frame adjusting, pipes shifting. A sound that in any other building would have been thermal contraction. Here it was attention, something vast and diffuse, pressed against the far side of every surface, leaning closer. "I know what you are," I said. The refrigerator motor cut out. The silence it left was too complete. "You've been dying for a long time, drifting through empty space with your mind coming apart, and you built this place because you needed something to hold." The kitchen light dimmed, then warmed. "You made it look like a home because you've been listening to us. Human beings, our transmissions, our biology, our mathematics, long enough to understand what a home is shaped like. Or what it looks like from the outside." A pipe clicked in the wall. Once, twice, a deliberate answer. "You took our lander because you were trying to keep us. You made the roads loop because this thought is the only world you can still hold. This street is the shape of what remains." The window over the sink filled with light. Not brighter light. More specific light. Late afternoon through a west-facing window, the colour of a kitchen where someone has been cooking, and the day has been long and the evening will be quiet. A quality of light that holds routine and presence and the expectation that the people in this house will still be here tomorrow. The residents you assembled, the photographs, the food you gave Martin. You were trying to complete the neighbourhood, fill the houses, hold the pattern together long enough that it might stop collapsing. The house gave a low groan. In the hallway, one of the framed photographs cracked. I stood. Every instinct told me to step back from that sound, but I stayed beside the table and placed both gloved hands on the surface. "We can't stay." The warmth withdrew sharply. Frost formed along the edge of the window frame. 4 men are a plank in a rising ocean. You're holding on to us because we're the only coherent pattern you've found, and we're too small. If you keep us, you'll exhaust what we carry, and the thought will still collapse. You will die alone anyway, inside a neighbourhood full of hollow men, wearing borrowed faces. The walls of the kitchen groaned, wood and drywall flexing under a stress that had nothing to do with structural load. The temperature dropped 2 degrees, held, and recovered. The photograph in the hallway was visible from where I stood. As I watched, it changed for the last time. My face remained at the head of the table. The figures around me clarified. The smears resolved. And what I saw, seated in domestic posture around a holiday dinner, wearing human clothes, holding utensils in appendages that had been shaped to approximate hands, were structures. Vast, curved, tessellated, the same geometric patterns I'd seen through the crack in the sky, compressed and folded and fitted into dining chairs. They were looking at me with something that might have been gratitude or grief, or both at once. The entity had shown me what it looked like when it stopped performing human. It was something enormous and terminal, wearing a family the way a dying man wears a blanket, sitting at a table because it had absorbed enough human signal to understand that tables are where families gather, and it wanted, in whatever way such a thing can want, to be gathered with. The kitchen light brightened, the walls steadied, the groaning stopped. Through the front window, I watched our lander materialize on the street, full size, correct dimensions, landing struts extended, hull intact, the Harmon Lusk decal catching the neighborhood's remaining warmth. The miniature on the shelf in house number 3 was gone. The entity had given it back. I keyed my comm. "Doug, the lander is on the street. Full size, flight ready." Confirmed visual. His voice stopped there for a beat. I went to house number 7. Martin was in the living room, standing by the window, his suit still heaped by the door. The plate from his meal had been cleared. The house looked more complete than any of the others, warmer, more detailed, carrying small touches of habitation the other houses lacked. A jacket hung over the back of a chair. Books lay stacked on an end table. A pair of shoes sat by the front door, Martin's size, worn at the heels the way shoes wear when they belong to someone. He turned when I came in. He already knew. "The lander is outside," I said. "Full size. We can go." "I know." He said it the way you confirm something you decided hours ago. "Martin, whatever is sustaining you here runs on the entity's cognition. When the entity dies, and it is dying, the sky is fractured, the residents are collapsing, the whole structure is degrading by the hour. This house stops being a house, and you stop being sustained." "By the hour for you," Martin said. "For me, this is the most stable environment I've occupied since Ganymede. The headache is gone. The insomnia is gone. The joint pain from the gravity transitions is gone. I am eating real food in a real room, and my body works the way a body should work. A suit designed for a different set of physical laws calls me dead. That's a problem with the suit, Ray. Which physics is more valid is exactly the question this place exists to ask. Your body is being sustained by a cognitive process in terminal failure. Everything is in terminal failure. The entity knows that. I know that." Martin said it gently, the way you say something obvious to someone who hasn't accepted it. "What it's offering is company while the failure runs its course. Shelter. And the chance to understand something about the nature of reality that no human being has ever had access to. You want me to trade that for a survey lander and a casualty report? I want you to live." His expression changed then. "Not much. Enough. I have spent 12 years looking for life in dead places," he said. "Every time I came back with sterile samples and a cleaner negative. This is alive in ways we don't even have instruments to describe. It is old and frightened, and trying to make a home out of signals it barely understands. Maybe staying here kills me. Maybe leaving does. But if I go back, all I can do is help Harmon Lusk write a hazard classification for the first mind we've ever found that was lonely enough to build us a porch light." I reached for his arm. My glove made contact, and for a moment his sleeve held. Warm fabric over muscle and bone, the ordinary resistance of a man's body. Then the resistance softened. My hand passed through his forearm the way a hand passes through heavy static, through dense signal, through organized sound wearing the shape of flesh. I pulled back. My fingers tingled with residual vibration. Martin's arm was intact, unmarked. He looked at where my hand had been, then at me, and his expression was calm. "Go, Ray. Take Doug and Neil and go. The lander works. The entity is already preparing to hold the launch corridor open. I can feel it reorganizing, pulling resources from the periphery. You need to go soon. The coherence window is narrowing." He held my gaze. His eyes were clear, brown, focused, and alive in every way my instruments denied. Behind them, behind the walls of number 7, behind the lawn and the sidewalk and the asphalt of Harlow Court, the vast presence Martin had described pressed against the borders of the visible world. Enormous, fading, afraid, grateful in its way for the man who had agreed to stay at the table. "It's all right," Martin said. "Tell them the biologist finally found something worth logging." I walked out of house number 7 and crossed the cul-de-sac to the lander. Doug and Neil were already at the boarding ramp. Neil had the pre-flight sequence running, his hands moving through the startup procedure. Doug looked at me, looked past me at the closed door of number 7, and understood. "Lacey?" "He's staying." Then he looked down at the empty 4th slot on the boarding roster. His thumb moved once against the edge of his glove, a small, useless motion, as if there were some box he had forgotten how to check. "Crew of 3, he said. His voice was rougher than procedure required. "I'll classify the casualty as an environmental exposure. Harmon Lusk will want a deposition from each of us." I'm sure they will. We boarded. Neil flew. The lander lifted from the street of Harlow Court, and as we climbed, the neighborhood dropped away beneath us. I saw it from a vantage the drone's overhead grid had never captured. The full cul-de-sac, all 7 houses, each one lit from within, every window warm, and in each doorway and on each porch and across each lawn, the assembled residents standing in postures of domestic evening, watching us rise with faces built from our voices and the sounds of the houses they inhabited. The geometric structures in the sky arched overhead, vast and curving, and from this altitude they resolved into what they had always been, the interior surface of a skull, or a thought, or whatever a dying mind uses for a ceiling. Martin stood on the lawn of number 7, looking up. At this distance, climbing, I couldn't tell whether he raised his hand. Then the viewport hazed with altitude frost, and the cul-de-sac dropped below the limit of my vision, and we were climbing through the dark between stars where nothing had built a home. We docked with the old gate. The mothership systems accepted our lander without error. The airlock cycled, the cabin pressurized. I pulled off my helmet and breathed ship air, recirculated, warm, carrying the stale weight of a closed atmospheric system, and my suit's biometric display confirmed what it had been unable to confirm inside the neighborhood. I was alive. Heart rate elevated, blood pressure high, core temperature normal, functional, intact, and carrying everything I'd seen in a body whose metrics were, for the first time in hours, legible to the instruments designed to measure them. The crew status board refreshed automatically. Peppers, Douglas, active. Harkin, Neil, active. Caldwell, Raymond, active. Lacey, Martin, signal lost. The board had not declared him deceased or inactive. It had called him lost. For a moment I heard his voice through the comm memory. Tell them the biologist finally found something worth logging. Doug went to the comm station to begin filing with Harmon Lusk, casualty report, environmental hazard designation, recommendation for sector quarantine. Neil ran post-flight diagnostics with the focus of a man who would keep checking systems until his hands stopped shaking or exhaustion pulled him under, whichever arrived first. I understood the impulse. I didn't share it. I went to my workstation. The geological survey, the entire reason Harmon Lusk had sent us to this planet, the deliverable that justified 4 men, a lander, transit time, and a mothership in high orbit, was waiting in the draft file. I opened it and began entering the rogue planet's coordinates into the header field. Standard format: right ascension, declination, distance, epoch. The coordinate string filled the field. I reviewed it and stopped. Martin's base pair analysis protocol was still loaded on my workstation from his demonstration inside the suburb. The software was running in a background window, its pattern-matching algorithm active. I copied the planet's coordinates, the full numerical string, the precise location of this world in charted space, and pasted it into Martin's analyzer. The algorithm processed for 6 seconds. Then it returned a match. The coordinate string encoded a fragment of human genetic information. Chromosome 11, a section governing neural development. The match was 97%. I did not let myself believe it. Coordinates are conventions, not fossils. Change the frame, change the units, change the precision, and a pattern should collapse into noise. So I stripped the notation. Ran the raw inertial vector. Converted from Harmon Lusk survey format to the Oldgate's navigation frame. Removed units and tested ratios only. Recast the position against 3 standard epochs and a barycentric reference. Each version should have destroyed the sequence. Each version returned the same fragment, shifted but intact, as if the genetic information was not hiding in one human notation, but pressing upward through every notation we used to describe where we were. The planet's position in space was a biological instruction, the mathematical grid that told us where things are, the coordinate systems humanity uses to chart the universe, to navigate between stars, to define the concept of location itself, carried genetic data in its structure. The planet hadn't drifted to these coordinates through gravitational mechanics or orbital decay. Either something had placed it here according to a pattern derived from human DNA, or the frameworks we treated as neutral descriptions of an objective universe were organized by the same logic that had built the suburb on the surface below. I stared at the numbers on the screen. I could file the survey, classify the planet as a geological anomaly with an associated navigational hazard, recommend the consortium skip this sector, collect my completion pay, and move on. 4 weeks of transit. Another nitrogen ice plane. Another preliminary report drafted before we touched down. But I would write that report using the same coordinate system. I would navigate by the same mathematics. I would measure distance, mass, position, and mineral composition, with instruments calibrated to a framework that the evidence now suggested was architecture. The load-bearing cognitive scaffolding of something that was thinking the universe into a shape. The way the entity had thought a suburb into existence on a frozen world. A framework organized the way a neighborhood is organized. A framework carrying the same biological encoding as the static in a cul-de-sac that should never have existed. I closed the file. The workstation screen dimmed towards standby, and in the darkening glass, I caught my own reflection, and behind it, for less than a second, a warm glow gathered in the shape of a lit window. Then the screen went dark, and I sat alone in the quiet of a ship whose position was defined by coordinates that might have been someone else's memory.